Hello, this is Dr. Ari Vandewa at the University of South Alabama. I am the Assistant Professor of Trombone and Music Business, and you are listening to the 2023 High School All-State Technical Podcast. Before I dig into this etude, I just want to reiterate, like I do every year, my practice approach for especially technical etudes. First, start at either half speed or 40 beats per minute. In this case, half speed is 50, so kind of completely fine if 40 is a little too miserable, right? Whichever tempo you pick, the goal is to pick a tempo where you have plenty of time to think about the notes that come next and to focus on clean, clear articulations and in-tune notes. When you feel you've mastered this really slow tempo, usually after 2 or 3 playthroughs, move the metronome up by 10 beats per minute or 5 if you need more time. And this speed should still feel comfortable after 2 to 3 playthroughs and should have the same clarity and intonation as the slower tempo. Continue moving up in this pattern. If you hit a snag where things start to become sloppy again, that's where you may want to return to the previous speed, run it 2 or 3 more times, and then finally keep working your way not only up to the target tempo of 100 beats per minute, but past it. If you can, to 105, or if you're feeling really spry, go all the way to 110, okay? Then from there, scale it back down. And that's all to sort of to build strength and build comfort with the etude, and then to build consistency with establishing that tempo. If you can actually follow this approach over the course of a few weeks, I can almost guarantee you that you will have all-state audition success. This approach requires a ton of self-discipline and a ton of sort of miserable, quote-unquote, practice, right, where we really just have to make ourselves play stuff at a slow tempo, even though that can be kind of boring. My private students that have taken this approach have almost all made all-state or at least made alternate, usually making red band as well. The only limiting factor often for me and my students is how many of my students are auditioning. The question you really have to ask yourself is, do I have the discipline to follow through with this approach over the course of a few weeks? And if you do, you will make all-state. As for specific tips for this etude, one of the first things that I have to say that's different about this etude is that certain editions have certain markings. Dynamics in particular in this one. I was surprised ever since I was made aware of the error sheet that dynamics didn't make the list on this one. Make sure that you get the ABA approved Arbon's book and that you're using that to make your decisions, okay, and that you're using that version to practice on. One general tip, do not crescendo all the way from measure 119 to the end of the etude, which is technically what is printed, but roughly crescendo to the downbeat of measure 120, and then retake the dynamic at piano just before kind of growing through the ascending lines, and that will help a lot with your air management. I am very partial to, speaking of different editions, I'm very partial to the phrasing that's highlighted in the Alessi Bowman version of the Arbon's book, which is kind of a nice sort of context for all of the piano playing and this retaking piano marking at measure 118. If you can access it, it's a great practice tool, and you can use it to see which markings you like and which ones you don't, and put them into your own edition. That said, again, make sure that you remember that all-state is kind of a test of following instructions, right? Following what's on the page as best you can. In order to do that, you have to have the right version of the page. So even the Alessi Bowman version, make sure that it's not very, very heavy and that it actually stays light and keeps moving. Phrasing is a really big separating factor in these etudes, and it's one of those things that can often make the difference between being an alternate or making all-state. We tend to undervalue phrasing. We tend to think about tempo, we think about tonguing, we think about accuracy of notes and all this stuff that's very important, but phrasing can really help us out with all that stuff. One thing that especially is tough in this year's etude is the breathing. And you'll notice there's some slurs that I break, and there's a few spots that I'm not super happy with. But remember, Arbenz was a trumpet player, and the register that this has been transposed to for us is a little bit more challenging for breathing purposes, especially at this tempo. If we went much faster into double tongue territory, which is maybe likely where this would have been played in real context, then it would be easier with the breath and we can make it more easily. But at this speed and in this register, the breath is really hard. So for phrasing, what we can do is as lines ascend, we can crescendo. As they descend, we can diminuendo. And this is a really safe approach to any sort of interpretive thing that you want to do, at least at first. You don't have to do that every single time a line goes up and it goes down, but it's a good thing to experiment with and to challenge yourself with. What's nice about this, again, if you follow this approach in this particular etude, is that you tend to match the style and manage your air more effectively, which will let you have a better tone, and that's really hard to do in technical etudes sometimes. Additionally, if you're not really sure what else to do, remember, as you practice, experiment. Record yourself often, and just sort of see what you like and what you don't like when it comes to phrasing. For articulation, one thing that I think is always really important to note in these technical etudes when it's not there is any sort of staccato markings. You are going to probably have to play somewhere on the spectrum of staccato, but try not to play it too short and too pecky. And one of the reasons being, again, it's going to interrupt that phrasing. It's going to make the etude feel kind of stale and uncomfortable. And it's going to sort of risk slowing you down with too much heavy tonguing when it's that short or spitty or dry, right? For breathing, it may be necessary to breathe after most of the eighth notes preceding 16th note runs, as well as to occasionally breathe after downbeat 16ths, like the ones in measure 114, 116, 119, and 120 if you need them. If possible, try to avoid breaking the slurs, especially in 114, 115, and 117. But it's very difficult to do and maintain tone. Again, the tempo that this is set at is a little bit on the uncomfortable side for us. Finally, make sure that while you start the piece at a soft dynamic, that it's not so soft that you can't articulate or phrase or have a good sound, right? Remember that dynamic markings when you're playing in a solo capacity are often related to how comfortable you are, right? How much force is in the sound if it's forte, how much relaxation is in the sound when it's piano is a good way to sort of think about it for solo playing. Additionally, I like putting a little bit of a tenuto line over the last eighth note of the etude just to help highlight that the piece has ended so it doesn't have a very abrupt dot and cut off, right? If you have any questions, you know how to contact me. You can find our information on our website. Happy practicing. Thanks so much for listening, and good luck.